Prosecutor for the United States of America.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. This tribunal, while it is novel and experimental, is not the product of abstract speculation, nor is it created to vindicate legalistic theories. This inquest represents the practical effort of four of the most mighty of nations, with the support of 15 more, to utilize international law to meet the greatest menace of our times, aggressive war. The common sense of mankind demands that law shall not stop with the punishment of petty crimes by little people. It must also reach men who possess themselves of great power and make deliberate and concerted use of it to set in motion evils which leave no home in the world untouched. It is a cause of that magnitude that the United Nations will lay before your honors. In the prisoner's dock sit 20-odd broken men, reproached by the humiliation of those they have led almost as bitterly as by the desolation of those they have attacked. Their personal capacity for evil is forever past. It is hard now to perceive in these men as captives the power which, as Nazi leaders, they once dominated most of the world and terrified most of it. Merely as individuals, their fate is of little consequence to the world. What makes this inquest significant is that these prisoners represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. We will show them to be the living symbols of racial hatreds, terrorism, and of violence, and of the arrogance and cruelty of power. We must never forget that the record on which we judge these defendants today is the record on which history will judge us tomorrow. We must summon such detachment and intellectual integrity to our task that this trial will commend itself to posterity as fulfilling humanity's aspirations to do justice. The most savage and numerous crimes committed by the Nazis were those against the Jews. Those in Germany in 1933 numbered about 500,000. In the aggregate, they had made for themselves positions which excited envy, and they had accumulated property which excited the avarice of the Nazis. They were few enough to be helpless, and numerous enough to be held up as a menace. Let there be no misunderstanding about the charge of persecuting the Jews. What we charge against these defendants is not those arrogances and pretensions which frequently accompany the intermingling of races and different peoples, and which are likely, despite the honest efforts of government, to produce regrettable crimes and convulsions. It is our purpose to show a plan and a design to which all Nazis were fanatically committed to annihilate all Jewish people. These crimes were organized and promoted by the party leadership, executed and protected by the Nazi officials, as we show you by written orders of the secret state police itself. The persecution of the Jews was a continuous and deliberate policy. It was a policy directed against other nations as well as against the Jews themselves. Anti-Semitism was promoted to divide and embitter the democratic peoples and to soften their resistance to Nazi aggression. As Robert Lye himself declared, I quote, "The second German secret weapon is anti-Semitism, because if it is constantly pursued by Germany, it will become a universal problem which all nations will be forced to consider." Anti-Semitism also has been aptly credited with being a spearhead of terror. The ghetto was the laboratory for testing repressive measures. Jewish property was the first to be expropriated, but the custom grew and included similar measures against anti-Nazi Germans, Poles, Czechs, Frenchmen, and Belgians. Extermination of the Jews enabled the Nazis to bring a practiced hand to similar measures against Poles, Serbs, and Greeks. The plight of the Jew was a constant threat to opposition and discontent among other elements of Europe's population: pacifists, conservatives, communists, Catholics, Protestants, socialists. It was, in fact, a threat to every dissenting opinion and to every non-Nazi's life. The persecution policy against the Jews commenced with non-violent measures, such as disfranchisement and discriminations against their religion, and the placing impediments in the way of success in economic life. It moved rapidly to organized mass violence against them, physical isolation in ghettos, deportation, forced labor, mass starvation, and extermination. The government, the party formations indicted before you as criminal organizations, the secret state police, the army, private and semi-public associations, and spontaneous mobs that were carefully inspired from official sources, were all agencies that were concerned in this persecution. Nor was it directed against individual Jews for personal bad citizenship or unpopularity. The avowed purpose was the destruction of the Jewish people as a whole, an end in itself, a measure of preparation for war, and a discipline for conquered people. The conspiracy or common plan to exterminate the Jew was so methodically and thoroughly pursued that despite German defeat and Nazi prostration, this Nazi aim largely has succeeded. Only remnants of the European Jewish population remain in Germany, in the countries which Germany occupied, and in those which were her satellites or collaborators. The 9,600,000 Jews who lived in Nazi-dominated Europe, 60% are authoritatively estimated to have perished. 5,700,000 Jews are missing from the countries in which they formerly lived. And over 4.5 million cannot be accounted for by the normal death rate nor by immigration, nor are they included among displaced persons. History does not record a crime ever perpetrated against so many victims or carried out with such calculated cruelty. You will have difficulty, as I have, to look into the faces of these defendants and believe that in this 20th century, human beings could inflict such sufferings as will be proved here on their own countrymen as well as upon so-called inferior enemies. Particular crimes and the responsibility of defendants for them are to be dealt with by the Soviet Government's Council when committed in the East and by Council for the Republic of France when committed in the West. I advert to them now only to show their magnitude as evidence of a purpose and a knowledge common to all defendants of an official plan rather than of a capricious policy of some individual commander, and to show a continuity of Jewish persecution from the rise of the Nazi conspiracy to its collapse, which forbids us to believe that any person could be identified with any part of the Nazi action without approving this most conspicuous item in their program. The indictment itself recites many evidences of the anti-Semitic persecutions. The defendant Streicher led the Nazis in anti-Semitic bitterness and extremism. In March of 1942, he complained that Christian teachings have stood in the way of, quoting him, radical solution of the Jewish question in Europe, and quoted enthusiastically as the 20th century solution the Führer's proclamation of February 24, 1942, that, and I quote, the Jews will be exterminated. And on November 4th, 1943, Streicher declared that the Jews, and I quote his words, have disappeared from Europe, and that the Jewish reservoir of the East, from which the Jewish plague has for centuries beset the people of Europe, has ceased to exist. Streicher now has had the effrontery to tell us that he is only a Zionist, that he only wants to return the Jews to Palestine. But on May the 7th, 1942, he wrote, and I quote, "It is also not only a European problem. The Jewish question is a world question. Not only is Germany not safe in the face of the Jews as long as one Jew lives in Europe, but also the Jewish question is hardly solved in Europe so long as Jews live in the rest of the world." Defendant Hans Frank, a lawyer by profession, I blush to say, summarized in his diary in 1944 the Nazi policy thus, and I quote, "The Jews as a race are a race which has to be eliminated. Whenever we catch one, it is his end." And earlier, speaking of his function as Governor General of Poland, Hans Frank confided to his diary this sentiment, quoting, "Of course I cannot eliminate all lice and Jews in only a year's time." I could multiply endlessly this kind of Nazi ranting, but I will leave it to the evidence and turn to the fruit of this perverted thinking. The most serious of the actions against Jews were outside of any law, but the law itself was employed to some extent. There were the infamous Nuremberg decrees of September 15, 1935. The Jews were segregated into ghettos and put into forced labor. They were expelled from their professions. Their property was expropriated. All cultural life, the press, the theater, and schools were prohibited among them. And the SD was made responsible for them. This was an ominous guardianship. It was ordered that an eventual act by the civilian population against Jews is not to be prevented as long as this is compatible with the maintenance of order and security in the rear of fighting troops. And again, the first main goal of the German measures must be the strict segregation of Jewry from the rest of the population. In the execution of this, first of all, is the seizing of the Jewish populace by the introduction of a registration order and similar appropriate measures. But it was desirable that the security police should not put in an immediate appearance, at least in the beginning, since the extraordinarily harsh measures were apt to stir even German circles. It had to be shown to the world that the native population itself took the first action by way of natural reaction. Of course, it is self-evident that these uprisings were managed by the government and the Nazi Party. If we were in doubt, we could resort to Streicher's memorandum of April 14, 1935, in which he says, "The anti-Jewish action of November 1938 did not arise spontaneously from the people." I still quote, "Part of the party formation have been charged with the execution of the anti-Jewish action." Jews as a whole were fined 1 billion Reichsmarks. They were excluded from all businesses, and the claims against insurance companies for their burned properties were confiscated, all by the decree of the defendant Goering. Synagogues were the object of a special vengeance. On November 10, 1938, the following order was given. I quote, "By order of the group commander, all Jewish synagogues in the area of Brigade 50 have to be blown up or set afire. The operation will be carried out in civilian clothing. Execution of the order will be reported." Some 40 teletype messages from various police headquarters, which will be introduced to you, will tell the fury with which all Jews were pursued in Germany on those awful November nights. The SS troops were turned loose and the Gestapo supervised. Jewish-owned property was destroyed. The Gestapo ordered 20 to 30,000 well-to-do Jews, and I quote the term well-to-do Jews, to be arrested. Concentration camps were to receive them, and the order provided that healthy Jews, fit for labor, were to be taken. As the German frontiers were expanded by war, so the campaign against the Jews expanded. The Nazi plan was never limited to extermination in Germany. Always it contemplated extinguishing the Jew in Europe, and often in the world. In the West, the Jews were killed and their property taken over in occupied countries. But the campaign achieved its zenith of savagery in the East. The Eastern Jew has suffered as no people ever suffered. Their sufferings were carefully reported to the Nazi authorities to show a faithful adherence to the Nazi design. I shall refer only to enough of the evidence of these to show the extent of the Nazi design and common plan for killing Jews. If I should recite these horrors in words of my own, you would think me intemperate and unreliable. Fortunately, we need not take the word of any witness but the Germans themselves. I invite you now to look at a few of the vast number of captured German orders and reports that will be offered in evidence to see what a Nazi invasion meant. We will present such evidence as the report of Action Group A of October 15, 1941, which boasts that in overrunning the Baltic state, I quote, native anti-Semitic forces were induced to start pogroms during the first hours of the occupation. But it continues, and I quote, from the beginning it was to be expected that the Jewish problem in the East could not be solved by pogroms alone. In accordance with the basic orders received, however, the cleansing activities of the security police had to aim at a complete annihilation of the Jews. Special detachments, reinforced by selected units. In Lithuania, partisan detachments. In Latvia, units of the Latvian Auxiliary Police, therefore performed extensive executions both in the towns and rural areas. The actions of the executive detachments were performed smoothly. The sum total of the Jews liquidated in Lithuania, I'm still giving the report, quoting the report, amounts to 71,105. During the pogroms in Kowenau, 3,800 Jews were eliminated, and in the smaller towns about 1,200 Jews. In Latvia, up to now, a total of 30,000 Jews was executed. 500 were eliminated by pogroms in Riga. Then there is a captured report from the Commissioner of Slusk on October 20th, 1941, which describes these executions more in detail. Let me quote from it. The first lieutenant explained that the police battalion had received the assignment to effect the liquidation of all Jews here in the town of Slusk within 2 days. Then I requested him to postpone the action 1 day. However, he rejected this with the remark that he had to carry out this action everywhere and in all towns, and that only 2 days were allotted for Slusk. Within these 2 days, the town had to be cleared of Jews by all means. All Jews, without exception, were taken out of the factories and shops and deported in spite of our agreement. It is true that part of the Jews was moved by way of the ghetto, where many of them were processed and still segregated by me. But a large part was loaded directly on trucks and liquidated without further delay outside of the town. For the rest, as regards the execution of the action, I must point out to my deepest regret that the latter bordered already on sadism. The town itself offered a picture of horror during the action, with indescribable brutality on the part of both the German police officers and particularly the Lithuanian partisans, the Jewish people, but also among them white Ruthenians, were taken out of their dwellings and herded together. Everywhere in the town, shots were to be heard, and in different streets the corpses of shot Jews accumulated. The white Ruthenians were in greatest distress to free themselves from the encirclement. Regardless of the fact that the Jewish people, among whom were also tradesmen, were mistreated in a terribly barbarous way in the face of the white Ruthenian people, the white Ruthenians themselves were also worked over with rubber clubs and rifle butts. There was no question of an action against the Jews anymore. It rather looked like a revolution. Then there are reports which merely tabulate the numbers slaughtered. Another example relates that in Estonia, all Jews were arrested immediately upon the arrival of the Wehrmacht,
And I call your attention to the fact that this is the report of the Wehrmacht, the army, which became implicated in this business along with the SS. Jewish men and women above the age of 16 and capable of work were drafted for forced labor. Jews were subjected to all sorts of restrictions, and all Jewish property was confiscated. All Jewish males of the age of 16 were executed, with the exception of doctors and elders. Only 500 of an original 4,500 Jews remained. 37,180 persons have been liquidated by the SEPO and the SD in White Ruthenia during October. In one town, 337 Jewish women were executed, I'm quoting from the report, were executed for demonstrating a provocative attitude. In another, 380 Jews were shot for spreading vicious propaganda. And the report continues, listing town after town where hundreds upon hundreds of Jews were murdered. In one town, 3,000. In another, 33,771. In another, 3,145. In another, 410. All listed in detail. Other accounts tell not of the slaughter so much as of the depths of degradation to which the tormentors stooped. For example, we will show the report made to the defendant Rosenberg about the Army and the SS in the area under Rosenberg's jurisdiction, which recited that in the presence, I'm quoting, of SS men, a Jewish dentist has to break all gold teeth and fillings out of the mouth of German and Russian Jews before they are executed. It also says men, women, and children are locked into barns and burned alive. It says peasants, women, and children are shot on pretext that they are suspected of belonging to bands. We of the Western world heard of Gaswagens, in which Jews and political opponents were asphyxiated. We could not believe it. But here we will produce for you the report of May 16, 1942, from the German SS officer Becker to his supervisor in Berlin. And this is the story that it tells. Gas vans in the C group can be driven to the execution spot, which is generally stationed 10 to 15 kilometers from the main road, only in dry weather. Since those to be executed become frantic if conducted to this place, such vans become immobilized in wet weather. Gas vans in Group D were camouflaged as cabin trailers, but vehicles well known to the authorities and the civilian population, which calls them death vans. The writer of the letter ordered all men to keep as far away as possible during the gassing. Unloading the vans after the gassing has atrocious spiritual and physical effects on the men who have to unload them, and they should be ordered not to participate in such work. I shall not dwell on this subject longer than to quote one more sickening document which evidences the planned and systematic character of these persecutions. I hold an original report, written with Teutonic thoroughness as to detail, illustrated with photographs, to authenticate its almost incredible text, and beautifully bound in leather, with loving care bestowed on a proud work. It is the original report of the SS Brigade General Stroop in charge of the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto, and Hans Frank was Governor General of Poland. Its title page carries this inscription: "The Jewish ghetto in Warsaw no longer exists." I shall ask your honors to examine with care the photographs with which this document abounds, showing the destruction of this ghetto, showing the people driven before the flames, with the title, "Jews and Bandits," women and children and old men, not a man of fighting age in the picture except the German soldiers. The masses lined up against the wall for execution. The picture to illustrate the text showing that they jumped from the windows during the flames to escape. Now let us read what General Stroop says he did. The resistance put up by the Jews and bandits could only be suppressed by energetic action of our troops day and night. The Reichsfuhrer SS ordered, therefore, on the 23rd of April, 1943, the cleaning out of the ghetto with utter ruthlessness and merciless tenacity. I therefore decided to destroy and burn down the entire ghetto without regard to the armament factories. These factories were systematically dismantled and then burned. The Jews usually left their hideouts, but frequently remained in the burning buildings and jumped out of the windows only when the heat became unbearable. Tried to crawl with broken bones across the street into buildings which were not afire. Sometimes they changed their hideouts during the night into the ruins of burned buildings. Life in the sewers was not pleasant after the first week. Many times we could hear loud voices in the sewers. SS men or policemen climbed bravely through the manholes to capture these Jews. Sometimes they stumbled over Jewish corpses. Sometimes they were shot at. Tear gas bombs were thrown into the manholes, and the Jews driven out of the sewers and captured. Countless numbers of Jews were liquidated in sewers and bunkers through blasting. The longer the resistance continued, the tougher became the members of the Waffen-SS, police, and Wehrmacht, who always discharged their duties in an exemplary manner. Frequently, Jews who tried to replenish their food supplies during the night or to communicate with neighboring groups were exterminated. Eliminated, says the S-Hander, I quote, a proved total of 56,065 Jews. To that, he says, we have to add the number of those killed through blasting, fire, and so forth, which cannot be counted. We charge that all of the atrocities against Jews were the manifestation and culmination of the Nazi plan to which every defendant in this box was a party. I know very well that some of these men did take steps to spare some particular Jew for some personal reason from the horrors that awaited unrescued Jews. Some protested that particular atrocities were excessive and discredited the general policy, while a few defendants may show some efforts to make specific exceptions to the policy of Jewish extermination. I have found no instance in which any defendant opposed the policy itself or sought to revoke or even to modify it. Determination to destroy the Jew was a binding force which at all times cemented the elements of this conspiracy. On many internal policies there were differences among the defendants, but there is not one of them who has not echoed the rallying cry of Nazism, "Germany awake, Jews perish." The real complaining party at your bar is civilization. Civilization asks whether law is so laggard as to be utterly helpless to deal with crimes of this magnitude by criminals of this order of importance. It does not expect that you can make war impossible. It does expect that your juridical action will put the forces of international law, its precepts, its prohibitions, and most of all, its sanctions on the side of peace, so that men and women of goodwill in all countries may have leave to live by no man's leave underneath the law.